Hello, students! Today, we're going to explore a really fascinating period of history. We'll be looking at the Russian Empire, which was once so huge and powerful, ruled by a czar. And we're going to see how, in just a few years, it all came crashing down. We're going to investigate exactly how the First World War helped to set the stage for a revolution that would change the world forever.
So this is the main question we need to answer today. How did a war, which started with so much excitement and patriotism, end with the complete collapse of the government? It's a very important question, so let's try to understand it step by step. You see, in 1914, when the war began, there was a huge wave of support in Russia. People were actually happy. They gathered in the streets cheering for their ruler, Tsar Nicholas II. Everyone believed this war would be a great adventure, that it would bring glory to their country. But that excitement, as we will see, did not last for very long. Okay, so let's start from the very beginning. Our first section is about this initial period, a time when the war was all about national pride.
Now, have a look at this map. It shows the two sides in the war. In the center, you have the Central Powers, which were Germany and Austria-Hungary. And on the other side, you had the Allied Powers, which included France, Britain, and of course, the huge Russian Empire. Just look at Russia's position. It had a very long border to defend against some very powerful enemies.
But all that pride and patriotism soon faded away. In our next section, we will see how the story takes a very sad turn, from national unity to defeat and complete demoralization. It's very important to understand that the war was different for Russia. In the West, soldiers were fighting from trenches. But here, on the Eastern Front, armies were constantly moving and clashing over huge areas. This meant the battles were extremely destructive, and the loss of life was just shocking. For the Russian soldiers, the dream of a quick victory turned into a terrible nightmare.
7 million. By 1917, this was the number of Russian casualties. Just take a moment to think about how large that number is.
So what do we mean by casualties? It means soldiers who were killed, who were injured, or who were taken prisoner. 7 million. That means 7 million families were affected. And it gets worse. As the Russian army began to retreat, they used a scorched earth policy. This means they burned crops and destroyed buildings so the enemy could not use them. But in doing so, they also made more than 3 million of their own people homeless refugees. Before the war, people used to call the huge Russian army the Russian steamroller. But by 1917, that army was completely exhausted. Just look at the faces of these soldiers. They were tired, they were defeated, and they had lost all hope. Most of them were simple peasants who had seen terrible things. They no longer wanted to fight for the Tsar. They just wanted to go home. So the situation at the war front was a complete disaster, but things were just as bad back in the cities and villages. This brings us to our third section, the collapse of the home front. The war had a terrible effect on Russia's industries. You see, Germany had blocked the Baltic Sea, so important industrial supplies could not reach Russia. The machines in the factories were old and they started to break down. Even the railway lines, which were needed to transport food and goods, began to fail. And on top of all this, all the healthy, able-bodied men had been sent to fight in the war, so there was nobody left to work in the factories. The whole economy was slowly coming to a stop. So, what did all of this mean for the common people living in the cities? It meant one very simple, very terrible thing: hunger. The government had to feed the massive army, so most of the grain was sent to the soldiers at the front. This meant there was very little food, especially bread and flour, left for the people in the cities. This quote really shows us how desperate things had become. I want you to imagine standing for hours and hours in the freezing cold Russian winter, just waiting for one loaf of bread. And then you find out there is nothing left. People were hungry, they were cold, and they were getting very, very angry. Fights and riots outside bread shops were happening almost every day. So, the army was in a terrible state, and the people at home were starving. What was the government doing about all this? Well, this brings us to our fourth section, a government in crisis. This table helps us understand the situation very clearly. The Tsar Nicholas II refused to listen to the main parties in the Duma, which was Russia's parliament. At the same time, he started listening to very poor advisors, like the monk Rasputin. This made people lose respect for the autocracy. That's the system where one ruler has all the power. As the country's problems grew bigger and bigger, the Tsar just seemed to ignore them. And so, the people's anger against him grew stronger and stronger. So, we have seen military defeats, a collapsing economy, and a government that was failing its people. In our final section, we'll see how all these things came together to make a revolution almost inevitable.
Now, this is a very important question. After all that we have discussed, you might think that yes, the war was the only cause of the revolution. But in history, things are usually a bit more complex.
The best word to understand the situation is catalyst. You may have learned this word in your science class. A catalyst is something that makes a chemical reaction happen much faster. Well, it's the same in history. Russia already had many serious problems before 1914, like poverty and a czar who was not very popular. The war did not create these problems, but it acted as a catalyst. It made all these existing problems much, much worse, and it made the revolution happen much, much faster.
So, let's quickly revise the pathway to revolution. First, the war began with lots of patriotic support. Second, huge defeats in the war destroyed the morale of the army and the people. Third, the economy collapsed, which led to hunger. Fourth, the Tsar's poor leadership destroyed all the trust the people had in him. And finally, the war acted as the catalyst that pushed the country over the edge.
And this brings us right to the edge of the revolution. By the beginning of 1917, the soldiers, the factory workers, and the peasants, they were all united against the Tsar. The government had lost all its support. So, I will leave you with this final question to think about. With everyone in the country against him, what do you think would happen to the Tsar next? The answer to that question is what we will learn about in our next topic, the February Revolution.